Obviously it's not a product, it's not a specific architecture, it's a strategy, it's a principle. It's really a cybersecurity paradigm. It's really a way that we have to protect. And you can use all the normal literature that says never trust, always verify, principle of least privilege, defense in depth. I add to it now really the notion of just-in-time access and then continuous verification, right? You'll hear those things as well. And I think the difference today from when it was really came out, I mean, if you look way back, the difference today is that it actually is something that can be done in reality because the technology has changed.
Jerry Chapman, welcome to the show. Jerry, what part of the country are you in today?
Hey, Scott. Yeah, I'm out of Alpharetta, Georgia. So I'm right outside of Atlanta.
Perfect. I'm down in Decatur, Georgia. So great to have you on the show. Jerry, I want to start off going through your career and a number of your accomplishments. And one thing that really stands out is um, you're a co author of a book regarding zero trust. And I'm always fascinated to hear the story from technical people and consultants, and really anyone who's ever written a book, what type of process you have to go through to really produce something like that and get it published. I mean, there's obviously the writing aspect, which can be very difficult, but I would imagine there's the editing, there's the review, and finally, there is the actual publishing. So, could you walk us through the whole process? So, what made you decide, hey, I'm working all these hours as a consultant and I've got a family, why not write a book? Why write the book first off?
So this is interesting. So my first off, my co-author Jason Garbis and I had met through uh, an organization that I was a part of at one point, and we had talked a little bit about zero trust back in 2000, 15 timeframe, 2017, and I had met Jason, and he reached out and said, "Hey Jerry, I have an idea." And I'm like, okay. So he sent me some information. I took a look at it. So yeah, let's do this. So it gets interesting because this was in December of 2019. Okay. So in February of 2020, Jason and I are at RSA meeting with a publisher. We had sent a couple of table of contents out to some publishers, and we decided to meet with our publisher in 2019. And she's like, "Yep, let's go." So we move forward. Um, so what made it really, really interesting is 2 weeks later, obviously COVID and we go into shutdown mode. And Jason and I signed the contract and we start writing. And just to be frank, before I say anything else, if it weren't for COVID, this book probably would never have gotten published. Because that's right. That's right. I mean, we weren't traveling, obviously, so we were able to spend the 10 months just hunkering down and writing the book. And one of the things, I had never written a book, so Jason had some experience, and we were ultimately going to meet a couple times in it between Atlanta and Boston and whiteboard some stuff out, but we couldn't do that. Obviously, COVID kept that from happening. So we were literally on Google Meets 3 times a week, if not 4 times a week, just talking through, working through consistently. It was so much fun, right? And just getting the book, and Jason was always a morning person. He'd be up early working, and I was always working until 2 in the morning, working at night. We kind of come together. It's just a very fun process. Um, and so getting through that and getting through that hump and getting the content written, getting it published in March of 2021 was huge. So the collaboration online with meets, I mean, during that time we were all doing Zoom and Teams and all the different, you know, but that's how we had to get through and write this book. So that was fun. It was quite an adventure. And like I said, if it weren't for the COVID, that book may never have been published.
That's fascinating. So, so maybe to go back a couple steps here for someone who is thinking about publishing a book. You mentioned that you were at a conference, you had an outline, and you showed it to a couple of publishers, but I feel like you missed a lot of steps before leading up to there. If someone who, for me, I'm not going to write a book, but if I was ever thinking about it, walk me through that process of even pitching the book. How does that work?
I'll be honest, I wasn't the lead person on that. My co-author Jason was the lead. He had had experience writing another book. So, but he kind of worked through it, and we just, what it was is, here's an excerpt from a chapter, here's a table of contents, here's what we're looking for. You send that through a proposal to different publishers, and publishers have a pretty standard format. You send that to a proposal to couple of different publishers, and they take a look at it and they decide whether they want it. And I'll tell you a funny story. One publisher, I won't say the name, but one publisher came back to us and said, "Hey, would you potentially change this book from Zero Trust Security and Enterprise Guide to Zero Trust, a Manager's Guide?" And we're like, "No, this is a this is the purpose of this book is from the CISO all the way down to the practitioner, and someone should be able to get something out of this." So it was an interesting concept because they just like, "No, we really want this type of book." And we're like, "No." So it just kind of going through that process and finding a publisher that was good with our vision, right? And be able to do that. And something interesting during that process, or during the editing process, is we were very adamant about zero trust, capital Z, capital T, being capitalized throughout the book. Editors naturally want to change that to be lowercase zero trust. It was fascinating, just that whole process. So
That I would imagine, just when you have technical people like yourself interfacing with the regular mortals of the world, if you will, trying to explain to them that zero trust is, it's uppercase, it's a thing, versus just zero trust in the natural English language, trying to get that through. So talk to me about what the writing process was like. So you mentioned that your co-author, he's the one getting up early and writing certain sections, and then you were staying up late. Were you all working on the same chapters together, or were you working on one chapter and he was working on the other? How did that collaboration work?
yeah, so that's interesting. So what we really decided to do was spend some time um, working on different parts of the books. Like I would work on a chapter, he'd work on a chapter, but then we would come together and collaborate. We would review, we would edit, we would say what we thought about it. So it was, let's divvy up the chapters, but at the same time, let's at least collaborate on and make sure we're all in agreement. And we did. So it was very collaborative the entire way through. It wasn't like, "Jerry, you're an identity guy, do the identity chapter." No, that's not kind of how it worked, right? It was, I would write the core of the chapter, and then we would mix it up and go through it. So it was just so much collaboration. And the bottom line is, though, you can't have, the way we looked at it is, you can't have two different authors solely writing single chapters, because then the voice or the tone changes, right? So we had to be collaborative so the tone was consistent throughout the book. And it came out, in my opinion, very well. Of course, it's my opinion, but I think the industry finds it to be a very, I've got nothing but rave reviews.
Well, I was actually looking at Amazon prior to the interview, just looking at the book, and I mean, you got a good number of reviews. I want to say it was, I think you literally have like 98 reviews on Amazon, if memory serves correct. I was up early this morning, so don't take that to the bank. But all most of them looked really positive. Of course, there are a few naysayers, but overall, it looked really positive. Um, and that leads me to my next question. Obviously, the pitching the book, that's a whole process. The writing the book, what happened during the editing process? What is that like? Did you have to have a number of different people review it, or what was that fact checking, if you will, process like?
So there was two processes. So it's interesting because this was a technical book. We actually had a technical reviewer. So we have a third party that was engaged, and he's actually mentioned, and he wrote one appendix in the book. He had his own little portion where he could write just a nice little excerpt. And so, but he had to technically review. So we had a technical reviewer throughout the entire process. We would submit the book. The publisher would then send that to the technical reviewer, and then the technical reviewer would review that context, put some additional data, validate it, and then send it back. And then the editing, well, that's just the editing. Are you speaking proper English, right? That's the, is everything right? But from a technical perspective, we did have a third party doing the technical reviewing, which I think added value to the book. Absolutely.
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. And I mean, I'm just looking down at my bookcase here, and I've still got a number of old school paperback technical books, and I always am struck by when you look at the introduction in a number of these books, just um, especially some of them where they really have to run a gauntlet, where there may be several people or several teams involved in the technical review of those books. And so I can only imagine just the number of revisions that you may have to go through for that. So it's a big process. So now once you get the book published, what about the marketing side of this? How did you go about promoting it? Do you just put it up on Packet and Amazon, or?
Jason and I had a huge advantage. Both of our organizations are in the cybersecurity zero trust space. Um, so outside of us just naturally promoting it through like LinkedIn and a couple other social media environments, um, our organizations did a lot of work, not to necessarily promote it, but we would do book signings. Um, Multiple conferences. We do book signings, and it just kind of continued to proliferate. And just word of mouth got out. People would notify us, "Hey, this is a great book. Can we talk?" And we would talk about it. And it was just a continuous cycle. And having both of our organizations in the cyberspace doing specific things is a part of that. And we're both co-chairs at the Cloud Security Alliance, right? So that's another big push that book is one of the zero trust resources in the zero trust working group at the Cloud Security Alliance. So it just continues to get that some publicity. I'll be honest, I just read an article 2 days ago on LinkedIn about passwordless and going passwordless, and honestly, our book was one of the references out of that for that article. It was an interesting thing.
That's very cool. So, another thing that I'm always fascinated about with people that do a lot of public facing work, like publishing technical books or speaking at conferences, in and to get down to brass tacks, what were the benefits, say, for you and your co-authors' careers? What were some tangible benefits that you found from being a published author?
You called it out, right? We're obviously engaged in public speaking events. We regularly speak at conferences. Um, from a career wise, it's just it's a nice badge, if you will, to have the ability to say, "Yep, here I am a recognized expert in this space, and this is what we do." So I think it's been definitely a career boost. And let's just be honest, based on the time frame, COVID, right in the middle during the COVID and the pandemic, this is what everyone started talking about. Because let's be, right before this, at when I was at my career at Optiv, for 2, 3 years, I was explaining people what zero trust was. I was going through the process of explaining what is zero trust, and more than just this concept of, oh, it's this flaky thing that's sitting out there, or nebulous thing that's sitting out there. Um, and it shifted after the book came out during COVID. Everything shifted from, well, the zero trust thing is more than a concept. It's actually something we should be doing. Help us do this. So this actually gave us the capability to do that. So I think everything just aligned, and it couldn't have been a better time, right place. Um, Everything kind of worked out. Yeah.
So to piggyback on those comments about zero trust, I'm always fascinated with these conversations because zero trust is one of those concepts that in the security industry we're all aware of. But what I find is that there's not necessarily an agreement about what zero trust is. It's not a product or a switch that you can turn on in your Azure tenant to say that I'm now zero trust. For the what does zero trust mean to you? And if I'm, say, a CIO listening to this or a consulting director listening to this, what is zero trust? And, what are some key things that if I'm looking to implement that in my organization that I need to think about?
You hit the nail on the head, Scott, right? It's everyone says it's something else. If you listen to vendors, they talk about it. Hey, our product helps you do zero trust. Obviously, it's not a product. It's not a specific architecture. It's a strategy. It's a principle, right? And if you think back to things like, I mean, we were talking about things like defense in depth. This is a military term that came out in the early 90s, I think it was. Um, we've been talking about, I've been doing identity for 24 years. We've been talking about principle of least privilege for 24 years. Whether we do it or not, that's a different story. But it's certainly something that we've been talking about. I think zero trust outside of the pandemic, right? If you think of what John Kindervag did back in 2010 or 2008 when he came out with the white paper to talk about that, the Google core stuff as you look at what everything that's been going or beyond core at Google, right? All that stuff that's really driven zero trust principles. It's really a cybersecurity paradigm. It's really a way that we have to protect. And you can use all the normal literature that says never trust, always verify, principle of least privilege, defense in depth. I add to it now really the notion of just-in-time access and then continuous verification, right? You'll hear those things as well. And I think the difference today from when it was really came out, I mean, if you look way back, 2005 with the Jericho Forum, obviously John Kindervag talking about stuff he did with, when he was at Forrester, and then Chase Cunningham doing stuff he did. I mean, everyone's done some great work with it. I think the difference today is that it actually is something that can be done in reality because the technology has changed. So if I'm a consulting director or if I'm a CIO or a CISO and I'm hearing the zero trust stuff, I now need to think about this from a business perspective because today um, your boards, your corporate boards are actually very interested in cybersecurity, right? They want to know that because of ransomware and all the attacks that are going on, um, it's now a business problem. So if I'm a CIO or if I'm a CISO, I'm thinking that as how am I protecting my business assets? So it's truly just another way to do cybersecurity. And ultimately, it has to be the only way to do cybersecurity if you really drive this, and you have to get business buy-in to do this.
It's definitely a cultural change. So then my next question here is that obviously zero trust is you can't go on LinkedIn or open up a trade magazine without seeing zero trust. But what's your opinion about the reality on the ground that when you talk with clients and I mean you work with all sorts of great organizations around the country, how many organizations are actually implementing zero trust versus talking about it?
Well, so I think it's interesting because I think there are organizations that are very mature and have looked at zero trust. Very few, let's be clear, that have looked at how do I implement zero trust principles, and have done a fairly good job. I think a lot of organizations go at it from a technology perspective. They look at it from, I'm trying to protect or I need to do zero trust and I'm going to do it with my endpoints. So they get an agent and they put an agent on those machines. So they get very, very technical perspective on I need to protect it at my endpoints. Some shift and like, no, I have to do micro segmentation or I have to segment my network, right? So what I find a lot of organizations are doing is they're focusing on the technology to drive the zero trust conversation and not that higher level business strategy, cybersecurity strategy of how do I do this? I recently published an article on LinkedIn to say, what is cybersecurity if not enabling the business? Um, and one of the things I said in there is I can take a safe and I can throw it in the ground and bury it, and if someone can't get access to it, what's the point, right? It's not enabling the business. So what I think a lot of organizations has to do to change that mindset is they have to come up and think of it from a business perspective. What business assets am I trying to protect? And how do I implement security controls to support that? And then it just changes the conversation a little bit. Um, and so the organizations have to, so a lot of the organizations, they're not doing that, all right? They're really focused on endpoints, networks, in some cases, data. And so it's very technical and not really taking it from a cybersecurity is a business problem. It is not a technology problem.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would definitely agree with that. Um, and interestingly enough, and I mean, you've been in the business long enough, and you've heard this as well, that often security is seen as an inhibitor to business. That it often prevents things from getting done. And now the challenge is in our industry is trying to enable the business and make it as frictionless and as secure as possible without interfering with the day-to-day type of activities. I mean, obviously easier said than done, but that's I think a huge challenge.
You mentioned frictionless, and I think security has to have just enough friction, right? Um, and one of my favorite use cases today is let's talk about passwordless. If we talk about a passwordless experience, and I'm being very specific to say, if I'm talking about a passwordless experience, what I'm doing is I'm enabling the users, I'm enabling the business to do things better, to do non-phishing MFA campaigns, to do, step up authentication, and enabling the user community to work easier and better without having to worry about, oh, I got to change my password every 90 days, right? If we enable the users from that perspective, what we've done is we've created a seamless or a just enough friction user experience. And on the back end, the security organization has the capabilities to drive um, to drive better security controls, right? And so with that, we now have the capability to do exactly what you just said, to enable the business, create a not frictionless, but just enough friction, and enable the business so that now the security, the weighting of the security going back and forth doesn't have to be security inhibits the business. It needs to be, no, we're enabling the business and we're securing the business.
That's a really great point because we've got a active project that we're working on where it's similar type of scenario where we were essentially called in to help to implement a passwordless solution because the security organization had implemented a 16 character password across the org, and you have these poor people in a warehouse who have to remember a complex 16 character password, and it was untenable. And out of curiosity, when you talk about passwordless from an end user perspective, what type of tech are we talking about to be able to do that? Is that biometrics or those FIDO keys? What are those type of things that you would have just enough friction to empower the user but not get in the way, right? Going back to your statement of just enough friction to keep them secure, what does that mean when you get down to brass tacks?
Yeah, so my favorite example. So brass tacks, right? First off, FIDO2 Alliance, they're doing great stuff to incorporate things like biometrics and identity assurance and those different elements to really support the passwordless experience. But here's what I my favorite analogy is in 2012, 2014 timeframe when iPhone came out with the facial recognition. Believe it or not, in my opinion, they made security cool, right? Because they were doing the commercials where use my face, I can paint my face, but it's still going to recognize my face, um, and it gave the generation or the users the capability to say, hey, my security is right here on my phone. So what it's done is that right there gives me a passwordless experience, right? Yes, I still have Active Directory doing stuff where it requires passwords, and I'm not going to get into that conversation. I've talked about that on several keynotes. But what I'll say is the passwordless experience, using the FIDO2 keys, using the FIDO2 authenticators, all the different authenticators that drive it. In addition to that, if you're looking at like Active Directory, Active Directory in 2008 implemented the smart card technology. Microsoft did a fantastic job of supporting that across the United States. I used to work with Microsoft and go into their different offices, and their teams had the smart card where they were not only authenticating to their devices, but they were authenticating to get into the business with the same smart card, right? And so Active Directory implemented that technology, and when they implemented it in 2008, it was fantastic. Very few people actually did that. I think Microsoft was one of the few organizations that actually did it and did it well. Well, now there are other vendors out there that are starting to do that, right? There is one vendor I'm thinking of. I won't get into names, but that's exactly what they do. They implement smart card technology to give you a truly passwordless experience. That is one of, or that's not a passwordless experience. That's passwordless, right? Because now the password is no longer valid or utilized in the authentication process for authentication when you're using the smart card technology. So that is the brass tacks to make that happen. And there's a couple vendors that are doing that now. And so between that and the FIDO2 the FIDO Alliance with the biometrics and all those things, it's a reality. It's just, quite frankly, it's a reality.
Definitely. I remember, to go back to your talk about wind or face recognition on the iPhone. I remember I was at Ignite. I can't remember. This was like years ago, and it was right when Windows Hello came out, and I was sitting next to a gentleman that had just implemented Windows Hello, and he opened up his PC, was getting ready to take notes during the keynote, and he was showing it to me, and I'm like, this is amazing. And I thought it was magic that you just open up the computer, it recognizes you. And i've I've been surprised that not a lot of organizations have implemented Windows Hello. I thought it would be everywhere, and we see it very rarely. We actually just finished, or in the process of finishing up, a Windows Hello project for that 16 character client. And again, I think it's magic. I think it's super cool, and I'm right there with you on the smart cards. We actually have a smart card implementation that I did nearly 8 years ago for a law enforcement client, that it's still being used, and smart cards are being used by the deputies in the squad cars still, and it's still chugging along. And I've told them you need to look at Windows Hello or some type of modern biometrics, but the smart card thing is still working. So yeah, it'll be. Again, my surprise here is that I'm just surprised that more organizations are not using those type of technologies, because clearly they are more secure. But with the FIDO keys, FIDO. I was at Identiverse last year in Las Vegas, and it was definitely. FIDO was definitely the next big thing. I think it's always been the next big thing for like the last 5 years. So, it's rather interesting just to see that certain people in the industry. There were a number of luminaries from Microsoft there also singing their praises, and obviously Microsoft's gone heavily into Fido as well. I'm just always surprised that you have some very cutting edge organizations that are adopting it, like your comment about Microsoft with smart cards and everything that they're doing. But when you get outside of those top tier organizations, you don't see a lot of people, or you don't see a lot of organizations getting away from the 1990 style Windows login for passwords. That's just not being done, at least in my experience. Most organizations are still very conventional, but perhaps you're seeing something different.
No, I mean, it's interesting because you said 1990 styles password. I mean, we're going back to the 60s, right? 1960s with passwords. So
I was being generous, Jerry. I didn't want to date us. Okay, I gave us 30 years.
I didn't start until the 90s, right? But yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's just been fun. And I love the Windows Hello. I actually was an early adopter of the Microsoft Surface Pro, and I've been using Windows Hello for a very long time and absolutely love it. So yeah.
Well, let's talk about consulting. And obviously, you've done lots of great stuff here, and it's always really interesting to hear how people got into consulting, either by choice or by just lucking into it. How did you get into consulting? Which camp was this? Something that you grew up saying, I wanted to be a consultant, and you got into the business, or were you tricked into it, or happened into it? What's the story there?
So I spent the first 10 years of my career in corporate, right? And just, working for large organizations or in some cases small organizations, but just on the, definitely implementing, doing support, whatever it was, programming, whatever I was doing. And in 2001, I happened to see an opportunity to go train, right, for a software company. Well, it turns out that software company was doing identity management, and I fell into it, and I started doing training, and I'm like, oh, this is cool stuff. So I started doing consulting at the same time. So I was consulting and training. That was 2001, and I did that for about 3 or 4 years. I did go back to the corporate side for a year, and actually I went to the local county government side for a year, and found that yeah, I cannot do this because I had a very different view on the world, and went right back to consulting and spent 17 years at what's now Optiv, um, consulting for the entire time, and it was absolutely fantastic, and I still do that. So it to your point, it was happenstance. It wasn't like, oh, I want to be this wonderful consultant. No, it was just fell into it, and I've loved it and enjoyed it ever since. It keeps you, in my opinion, keeps you on the edge of technology.
It keeps you on the edge. I definitely agree with that. You're on the edge.
So yeah, 17 years doing that.
Wow. What was your first assignment? What was your first consulting assignment, out of curiosity?
Way back, 2002, 2003. Um, I will say it was a big. I wouldn't say it was my first. It was right around that time frame. Um, I was doing Microsoft stuff, right? So back in the early mem days, right? Back then it was MMS, and I actually knew James Booth from Zoom It, right? Who was with Zoom It. So my first gig started doing, around that time frame. I was doing MMS. It was back then, it was MMS 2.0, and then it became MIIS, and then ILM, blah blah blah. But it was just doing that type of work, and working for a large, just so many different things. I mean, so many. What was the very first one? I can't even. Oh wait, I got it. Yes, Arizona. I had to fly out to Arizona, and I rem, it was a Blue Cross Blue Shield in Arizona. That was the very first thing I did, and I remember that because that's when I signed up for my Marriott Bonvoy points back then, and became a Marriott Bonvoy.
The most important thing is your Bonvoy points.
Yes, and that I remember that because that's where I signed up for them, and it just happened I was staying at a courtyard. I'm like, yeah, let me sign up for the points.
Sure. Another launch of a great relationship. So the Bonvoy points. It's interesting that once people get into consulting, and if you enjoy it, it is really hard to ever leave consulting and just going back to a standard corporate job. I think for people that really like yourself who take to consulting, there's the variety, and there's always something new that's going on, and there are new scenarios, new people, and it's just a constantly changing landscape. And staying, I can imagine just going to like a local government organization, and obviously they do wonderful and important work, but it's a completely different environment compared to consulting. And so I'm not surprised that you left the organization. So you stayed at Optiv for 17 years, which is, I'm trying to think, what's a greater accomplishment, writing a book during COVID, or having a 17-year career in one organization, which, I mean, that's unheard of. Um, Walk us through 17 years at one organization. What was that like?
So let's be fair, right? It started. It wasn't. Optiv when I started. It was a small organization that was based out of Atlanta. We were a niche identity company. We did 100% identity that got acquired by a bigger company called Fishnet Security. And Fishnet Security did not have an identity arm, so we were completely new to them. They were growing their cybersecurity by acquiring a small company. So I stayed through that process, and then in 2015, Blackstone, was the primary investors in Fishnet, said, "Hey, there's this company over here called Accuvant who's just like you guys, and then there's you guys, Fishnet, come together and create a new company." And so I stayed there because, people ask me, why did you stay so long? And it goes back to what I just said. I was always doing something different. It wasn't like I was stuck doing something, and there was so much opportunity and so many different people to meet and so many different things to happen. Um, the last 3 years at Optiv was so much fun. I was an engineering fellow. It was pre-COVID, post-COVID, or during COVID, post-COVID. I was speaking at many conferences. Optiv has a conference they used to do. I spoke at every one of them. I was really, really doing thought leadership conversations. I was in front of clients. I was doing zero trust. Just so many things. It was just such a dynamic environment. I mean, it was a very difficult decision to leave. To be fair, um, but it, the whole time there was um, just an interesting time, and I would never trade that because I learned so much and got to know so many people, and the organization was fantastic. So and to that, and again, I got to do so many different things at Optiv. I wasn't doing one thing and one thing only for 17 years. That's why I stayed.
Very cool. Um, uh, Before the show, we were talking about a fairly rather interesting award that you won in your consulting career back in 2008, the Jack Bauer Award. And I'm really curious to learn more about the Jack Bauer Award. Could you clue us in and tell us, were you involved in some type of Russian counterintelligence when you were working at Fishnet and Optiv, or what was involved in that award?
So very early, the company was still Logic Trends was the name of the company. And we were in Miami, and we were able to bring our spouse and come down to Miami, and we had our a yearly collaborating session. And they were giving awards for the year. Now, prior to this, we had a customer that was a big customer that was very upset with the current engagement and was refusing to pay. And they're like, unless we get to X plot, we're not going to do anymore. So they're like, Jerry, can you come in and do this? So Jerry swooped in and got the customer going, got the customer in production, did some wonderful things. Not to break my arm, pat myself on the back or anything, but came in, swooped it, did some really cool stuff. Didn't really think about it because to me, I was just doing my job. I was doing what I do. And so we're sitting at at the dinner reception in Miami, and my wife is sitting next to me, and the guy up front, one of the partners, I think it was talking about this Jack Bauer Award, and they're talking about how Jack Bauer swoops in and saves the day and does all this stuff, and ironically, I turned to my wife, and I'm like, who is Jack Bauer? Because I had no idea. And my wife turned to me. She's like, Kiefer Sutherland, 24. I'm like, oh, the spy. Yeah, yeah. Oh, and then they call my name. I'm like, oh, okay. So I just win this award. I'm like, okay, it's so funny. It was such a great event, and it was a lot of fun. So that was a great award that I honestly would never have expected, but it was fun.
That's very cool. And like you said, the best thing is you were just doing your job and you got recognized for it, and you weren't thinking that you were doing anything extraordinary, but I guess that goes to, your standard of excellence that you just think that higher level, and it's nice to be recognized for that. So that's fantastic. Well, let's talk about what's going on today. So you touched on, you made the difficult decision to leave Optiv after 17 years kind of in that whole channel through all the different acquisitions. Where are you today and what are you doing?
So leaving Optiv, I left for another company, and I'm not gonna get into that too much, but I came to find this company here in Duluth, Georgia called Veranext. They changed their name in January of last year from Veristore. They were historically a data storage company, and then four companies came together and they came up with Veranext. Um, it's a great organization. The executive leadership is very hands on, and it's a the culture. I couldn't speak enough about the culture. The people are just great. And what they had is that about 6 or 7 years ago they brought on some great talent to build a security practice, and they've been doing that for about 7 years. They've been doing fantastic. But the conversation that they've not had is identity. And as we all know, identity is just a core element when you start talking about cybersecurity. So they decided at some point they wanted to bring in an identities person to build an identity practice. Um, and they say they took a year to find me. I happened to get a referral from a friend of mine who was talking to them at the same time, and he called me. He's like, "Hey Jerry, I think this is the perfect role for you." So I talked to them, and here I am. I've been here for about 8 months, building an identity practice. We're I plan to have an exponential growth by the end of the year. We're doing some really interesting things. So it's really fun. I couldn't speak higher about an organization. They are just doing really good stuff, and the ability to build a practice the way I think a practice should be built. It's a little bit of what I did at Optiv, but a lot more of what I wanted to do at Optiv that I couldn't do that I can do now, which is just fantastic.
Well, and it's exciting. It's got to be exciting where it's kind of your own show too, where you're building a practice from the ground up. Whereas, at Optiv, obviously, through Fishnet, Logic Trends, all of that, you kind of there was that organizational structure already for an identity practice. So that's got to be really exciting. Well, best of luck with that. And final question here as we come to the top of the hour. Obviously you're working a lot, you're traveling, but you're also very passionate about charity work and giving back inside of the community. Tell us about a couple of organizations that you're really passionate about, and say a few words about them.
So there's one organization it's out of South Atlanta. It's called Get Hype. It's really an organization that is focused on underprivileged women and getting into IT and cybersecurity. And they really spend a lot of time training, and I wish I could say I spent more time with them. And I'm trying to get back to where I can spend more time and help develop some of that curriculum. But it's a great organization. And the capabilities and the opportunities that they provide it touches me personally. I have a wife, I have two daughters, and my dog before she passed away was a girl. So I have nothing but women in my house. Uh, and it's just a passionate thing for me because I really want to see the growth of women, and then just the fact that we're giving opportunity for potentially underprivileged women to get into IT and get into cyber. That is just it touches my heartstrings. It touches what I am, and I think it's a great organization doing what they're doing. So um, personally, I want to be more involved and get more involved. I got to get less busy to do that, and I know it's an excuse that's coming. So
There you go. Well, Jerry, thank you again so much for being a guest on the show. Fascinating to hear about your consulting career, your Jack Bauer Award, writing a book during COVID, learning about zero trust. So, where can people learn more about you if they want to get in contact with you, Jerry?
I'm on LinkedIn, Jerry Chapman at LinkedIn. It's easy to find me. Just if you do zero trust, you'll find me. I'm connected with John and Chase and all the guys that talk about zero trust. I'm also at the CSA. Like I said, I'm a co-chair on the client on the Cloud Security Alliance for the Zero Trust Working Group. Happy we need people there. If you're interested, let me know. We'll get you engaged. We have lots of opportunity.
I'd love to. I'm trying to actually stop working as much as I am now. So,
Understood.
but that would be something fun to do. But yeah, I'm actually we're hiring also, so I'm trying to get some of my life back as well. But well, awesome. Well, thank you again, Jerry. It was wonderful to have you on the show. And again, connect with Jerry on LinkedIn and buy that book on Amazon. So again, Jerry Chapman